Hello, and welcome back to Chapter 12 of our Art in America series. Today we're going to be continuing our survey with a look at American art in the 1940s and 50s. For many in America, the 40s and 50s represented a time of prosperity, opportunity, and patriotic pride. But it was also a time with its own deep insecurities within the post-war global order. Today, we're going to see how a group of New York artists, led by Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning, found themselves the new standard bearers of modern art, while the American public at large settled into a post-war world newly awash with commercial imagery. This growing tension between high art and mass media spotlighted a nation on the verge of a major cultural inflection point. After the Second World War, the U.S. was emerging as a nation of unprecedented wealth and global power. As American products and American expertise flowed out to markets overseas, American cultural influences too spread across the globe. With Europe shattered by war, America grew rich, and by exploiting the lessons in design and marketing first learned in the 1930s, U.S. companies began their relentless campaign of selling the American way of life along with the household products that represented it. That American way of life was largely defined by its supposed opposite, life in the communist totalitarian Soviet Union. And after the Soviets became nuclear capable, the stakes were even higher. Americans were taught to believe in a world locked in a fundamental battle between good and evil. During the 1950s, the consumer products of capitalist American industry were enlisted as diplomatic tools for shaping the global balance of power. When Vice President Richard Nixon visited Moscow with a U.S. trade mission in 1959 and stood before a model kitchen with Soviet Premier Khrushchev, he pointed out all the latest conveniences, remarking that those automatic dishwashers, deep freezers, and rotisserie grills were available to everyone in America. Khrushchev must have felt blindsided by Nixon's undiplomatic jab. He lost his temper, spluttering that these machines were just gadgets, distractions, irrelevant to a society's true greatness. He added, sneering, "Do Americans also have machines to help push the food into their mouths for them?" By the 1950s, the global dominance of America, militarily, economically, and culturally, was undeniable. It reinforced the long-standing belief in American exceptionalism that had first arrived with the Puritans 300 years earlier, that America was a unique nation with a unique mission on Earth. That cultural dominance was about to extend into the world of art as well, although not in a way that most Americans would understand. As Paris had once been Western art's undisputed capital, and Rome before that, New York now became the leading city of the art world. One reason for this was the sheer number of European modernists now living in New York. These included Marcel Duchamp and Piet Mondrian, the Bauhaus figure Walter Gropius, and most importantly, a large contingent of prominent surrealist artists: Salvador Dali, Max Ernst, André Masson, the Chilean painter Roberto Matta, and, most important of all, Surrealism's founder, the poet André Breton. Surrealism, with its use of dream imagery and subjective memory, was an especially strong influence on the young New Yorkers, and it came just as Middle Americans were discovering and experiencing the psychoanalytic methods and treatments prescribed by Freud and Jung that had first inspired the Surrealist artists a decade or more earlier. These traits are first found in American art in the work of Arshile Gorky, whose ready assimilation of the Surrealist approach was a major influence on the young artists who would become known as abstract expressionists. As a boy in Armenia, Gorky and his mother were forced to flee the genocide of 1915-1920, and she died during their exodus. In the 1920s and 30s, Gorky settled in New York, and his paintings of this period are built from the memories of his mother and their former life in Armenia. Gorky proved adept at managing different facets of modernism in his art. In The Artist and His Mother, he uses the shifting planes and flattened forms of Cézanne and Picasso with a classical line reminiscent of Jean-Dominique Ingres. The painting is based on a treasured family photograph, and a comparison of the two shows how his painting is not a simple copy, but has been adapted and shaped through Gorky's use of selective memory and symbolism. By the time he painted Garden in Sochi, based on memories of a peaceful garden at his family home in Armenia destroyed during the atrocities, Gorky's style had changed to a much more abstracted and symbolic kind of representation. That's his mother hanging out the laundry to dry, if you can't see it right away. Certainly, Garden in Sochi shows how Gorky was influenced by the Surrealists, especially Juan Miró and André Breton. Breton had said that artists should paint their emotions, thoughts, visions, and mental states, not by making pictures of things, but by giving those emotions and thoughts direct expression in their work. This was the approach Gorky began to take, to allow his mind's subconscious to express itself, freed from the constraints of conscious representation. In his painting, provocatively titled "The Liver is the Cock's Comb," Gorky shows off the surrealist gesture fully integrated. He also demonstrates his new appreciation of the dense and moody color of the expressionist Vasily Kandinsky, a color sense which animates this dance of Miró-like figures moving through a vague, glowing landscape. No less an authority than Breton himself pronounced it the best painting ever done in America. Then, just as Gorky's fame and influence began to be recognized, a series of misfortunes, fire, injury, paralysis, divorce, overwhelmed the artist's life, and in 1948 he hanged himself. The first, though not the last, of the abstract expressionists to meet a violent end. Gorky's exploration of the symbolism of dreams and the techniques of automatism, the spontaneous, unplanned generation of art direct from the unconscious, would be crucial to the artists who would carry the torch of abstract expressionism forward, especially Willem de Kooning. Willem de Kooning was born in the Netherlands, studied art at a technical college in Rotterdam, and worked as a marketing designer for a Rotterdam department store before stowing away on a ship bound for New York. Like Gorky, and largely because of Gorky, de Kooning's early New York paintings show an awareness of Picasso, Surrealism, and other current trends in European art. His seated figure, classic male, from about 1940, was directly inspired by Gorky's self-portrait as a boy with his mother. Whether or not this seated figure is meant to be de Kooning himself, the painting shares the earlier Gorky's plainer forms, but here with lost edges and abrupt shifts of scale that enhance its indistinct, dreamlike quality. De Kooning followed Gorky's path into surrealist gestural work too, with works like Excavation, combining, as Gorky did, the sliding, fragmentary perspectives of Cubism. De Kooning once referred to himself as a slipping glimpser of reality, along with the biomorphic squiggles and hidden symbolic archetypal shapes beloved by the surrealists. Like Gorky and the other early abstract expressionists, this release of psychic truth was accomplished by leaving the process of creation visible within the work. Each bold brushstroke and visible gesture supposedly providing evidence of the artist's act of self-revelation and self-fulfillment. The way that image is formed out of those individual stabs of paint became a recurring theme with de Kooning, especially in his series of woman paintings from the 1950s. Each of de Kooning's women appear from the confluence of a welter of slashing, vigorous brushstrokes. The great American art teacher Robert Henry, too, had that the brushstroke always reveals the evidence of the artist's emotional state at the moment of creation. The impression in de Kooning is of an epic battle with the forces of art. Sometimes the paint wins, sometimes the figure wins, but each act of creation, each artistic choice, is played out for all to see in the arena that is the canvas. Jackson Pollock is the artist whose name is most closely associated with abstract expressionism today. When Life magazine featured him across 2 pages in 1949, emblazoned with the self-fulfilling question of whether he was America's greatest living painter, mainstream America naturally assumed he must be. Pollock became the first celebrity abstract artist ever produced in America. He lived his life with a manly intensity born of his Western upbringing, and he became even more of a celebrity when he died suddenly in a brutal car wreck, driving drunk down a dark road with 2 young women in the car, neither of them Pollock's long-suffering wife, the painter Lee Krasner. You may already have your own impression of Jackson Pollock. The poured and splattered paintings of the late 40s and early 50s, the wild man Jack the Dripper, celebrated in the media. But you might be surprised to see some of his work from the 1930s. Works like Going West or Cotton Pickers hardly seem like they're even by the same artist. These early works do make more sense when you consider Pollock's training. Born in Wyoming and raised in Arizona and California, Pollock studied with the regionalist Thomas Hart Benton in New York. Like most American artists, Pollock's work in the 1930s dealt with themes of social realism and the American scene. Pollock later said that Benton gave him a strong foundation to react against. By the late 30s, Pollock was in treatment for his alcoholism, joining a growing trend in New York towards psychotherapy for all sorts of neuroses and addictions. Pollock became aware of Carl Jung's theories of universal symbolic archetypes buried deep within our collective human unconscious, and during his therapy tried to pull those disguised meanings and deep symbols from his own memory and imagination. Around this same time, he also became interested in the work of Masson, Breton, and the Surrealists who were likewise seeking an artistic access to the world of the unconscious. Their influence can be seen in Pollock's works of the early 1940s, like his Pasiphae, with its mythical theme of animal lust and silent totemic figures standing by like guardians of a remote vision. The surface is replete with automatist gesture, thick, long strokes, many of them executed with such vigor that they go right off the edge of the canvas. More of Pollock's totemic archetypes writhe and dance across his 1943 mural, whose bulging and pulsing forms reflect the surging energy also seen in the paintings of his teacher, Benton. This painting's overwhelming scale, nearly 20 feet in length, recalls Pollock's oft-stated admiration for the Mexican muralists José Clemente Orozco and Diego Rivera, as well as his own years spent working on the vast public murals of the Federal Arts Project. The painting was commissioned by Peggy Guggenheim for the hallway of her apartment in New York City. By the time of Autumn Rhythm in 1950, Pollock had developed the mature, all-over style for which he became famous. These works, filling the field of vision with their horizontal span and their jaw-dropping scale, become transcendental spaces like the vast 19th century landscapes of Frederick Church and Albert Bierstadt had been. Pollock laid his canvas flat on the floor of his studio and looped the fluid paint, often commercial enamel house paint, onto the surface from the end of a stick, or poured it directly from the can. He claimed that this technique was inspired by the ceremonial paintings of the Southwest Indian rituals he had seen as a boy, made by pouring colored sands in patterns on the floor. Pollock and the other abstract expressionists had powerful allies within the New York art world, wealthy patrons like Peggy Guggenheim, curators like Alfred Barr of the Museum of Modern Art, and gallery owners like Leo Castelli. All of them with the power to make or break artists' careers, and all of them with a stake in the fortunes of the New York school. Equally important was the support of writers, like Pollock's friend, the critic Clement Greenberg, whose aesthetic theory was based on the notion of artistic progress, each of the arts becoming ever truer to its own nature as media adapted to expressive ends. In Greenberg's view, art progresses by ridding itself of all extrinsic influences over time. In the case of painting, that means removing from painting all literary, historical, or other narrative elements not related to the fundamental truths of the painting's own color, texture, and gesture. By this appeal to artistic purity, Greenberg argued that abstraction was the only meaningful route left for painters, who at last could escape from the prison of having to represent the real world, and instead could renew their commitment to an art beholden only to itself. Conveniently, this argument also led to the inevitable conclusion that Pollock and the abstract expressionists, with their emphasis on painterly gesture as the revelation of emotional truth. Remember, Pollock had said, I want to express my feelings, not to illustrate them. We're now at the cutting edge of this narrative of artistic progress. The writings of Greenberg and other New York critics joined with the self-interests of the art world's powerful movers and shakers to put abstract expressionism right at the center of the modern art discourse. Along with Pollock and de Kooning, other prominent members of the New York school in the 1950s included Barnett Newman, Mark Rothko, Robert Motherwell, Franz Klein, and Adolf Gottlieb. Newman, like Pollock, favored enormous canvases and all-over compositions. But instead of Pollock's webs of woven paint, Newman's canvases are filled edge to edge with broad, subtly modulated monochromatic fields of color. Painterly gesture is usually confined to one or more vertical stripes bisecting that field, which stand out like glowing shafts of light as the background hue saturates and takes over the viewer's perception. Rothko's paintings were in a similar vein, helping to establish color field abstraction as a second branch of abstract expressionism, an alternative to the so-called gestural abstraction or action painting of Pollock and de Kooning. Rothko's color fields support luminous floating blobs of harmonious color, stacked blurry rectangular clouds, their ethereal quality accentuated by Rothko's multiple layers of transparent glazes, giving a sensation of constantly shifting contour that makes the glowing shapes seem to levitate. They are, in some ways, the opposite of Pollock, meditative rather than energetic, mysterious rather than revelatory. Rothko said he saw them as timeless and tragic, but that may just have been his own demons speaking. Rothko committed suicide by slashing his wrists in 1970. Like the other painters of the New York school, Robert Motherwell's career was spent in search of a personal language of abstract forms through which symbolic truths could be represented. Motherwell's visual language of floating ovoids and fat parenthesis shapes, as in his Spanish Elegy series, are rendered with concealed layers, stark black-white contrasts, and monumental scale to denote the artist's personal response to the horrors of the Spanish Civil War. Motherwell was the intellectual among the New York school, and he became a reliably quotable spokesman for that group's aims. Black and white contrasts are also strongly associated with the work of Franz Klein. Inspired equally by the girders and structural grids of the city, and by gestural abstractions trove of subconscious meanings hidden within each brushstroke, Klein got himself an opaque projector. Practicing on pages torn from the New York phone book, Klein made quick gestural brushstrokes on the pages, choosing the most expressive of them to put into his projector to be blown up to wall size and repainted. With each spontaneous brushstroke, now amplified to a magnitude greater than that of the artist himself, Klein's paintings perfectly embody the abstract expressionist ideal of the brushstroke as the root of artistic meaning. Constructed equally from black mass and white space, they inhabit an artistic realm halfway between calligraphy and architecture. Aside from insights into the mind derived from Freud and Jung, and the visionary subjects and spontaneous methods of the Surrealists, the other main influence on the early development of abstract expressionism was the increasing visibility of ethnographic art from diverse world cultures, and its welcome acceptance by modern art critics and curators as evidence of a universal aesthetic language independent of historical convention. Ever since Gauguin's South Sea appropriations and Picasso's tribal masks, modern artists had felt that pre-industrial cultures, African, Asian, Native American, were still possessed of innate understandings of beauty and symbol, unspoiled by layers of cultural conditioning. This philosophy, related to the Enlightenment ideal of the natural man, fit well with Jung's theory of universal archetypes and was exploited in the abstract expressionist pictographs of Adolf Gottlieb. Signs for body parts, physical sensations, natural phenomena, presented with the stripped down symbolism common to road sign iconography: hands, eyes, the sun, arranged into formalist grids like a hieroglyphic tomb painting or like a ceremonial slab of the ancient world. Of course, here there is no real message, except for any that the viewer creates in his or her own personal connection with the painted symbols. Later in his career, Gottlieb's imaginary landscapes developed a visual iconography similar to Motherwell's, with Platonic celestial orb forms floating above a terrestrial foreground of agitated painterly gestures. The sculptor most closely associated with the abstract expressionists was David Smith. Smith dropped out of college to take a job as a welder in an automobile plant. He moved to New York in 1927 to enroll at the Art Students League, and while in New York, he fell in with the circle of Gorky, de Kooning, and Pollock. Smith was fascinated by the modern art he saw in New York, Picasso and Mondrian, as well as the Expressionists and Surrealists. As a trained welder, new to modern art, he was especially encouraged by the Russian constructivists and by Julio Gonzalez, who, along with Picasso, had created the very first welded metal sculptures in history during the early decades of the 20th century. Those early modernists had used welded iron and steel to rebel against the standards of classical sculpture, traditionally carved or modeled in respectable marble and bronze. They adopted new materials and methods as a provocative act, a departure from the norm. But for Smith, welded metal was the norm. He grew up on it, and for him, it was the perfect medium to represent his own mid-century industrial world. Smith rose to become America's preeminent post-war sculptor. He received a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship in 1950 and a MoMA retrospective in 1957, and he attracted important patrons and sponsors from all around the world. In 1962, an art festival in Italy commissioned Smith to create a series of sculptures for the event and gave him the use of an abandoned welder's shop in the small town of Voltri, near Genoa. To Smith's delight, the site provided not only a place to work, but an abundance of sculptural material in the form of rusted steel scraps and machine parts. From these, he fashioned his Voltri series, incorporating cast-off fragments of rejected industrial material. Smith's Voltri sculptures speak of a fanciful world of once beautiful machines, now quaintly creaky and sadly over the hill. There's a nostalgia here and a surrealist's sense of the world just slightly skewed, as if in a funny dream. Within the Voltri sculptures, actual tools and fragments of tools appear in different guises, as themselves, as abstract compositional forms, as surrealist symbols, or as references to Smith's own act of constructing. In the 1960s, Smith created his cubi sculptures, vertical arrangements of welded boxes, monumental in scale, but despite their rectangular geometries, more figural than architectural in overall effect. Their primary forms and stainless steel construction are seen as important precursors of 1960s minimalism, as we'll see. Though Smith is really closer in spirit to the heat of the 1950s abstract expressionists, than to the hyper-cool minimalists who would arrive in the 1960s. A handmade quality is always visible in his welding, and he often applied a grinding wheel to the surface of his works, or painted them roughly with enamel to further emphasize his active participation in the creative process. Surrealist and constructivist ideas entered the work of other American sculptors through various routes. Louise Nevelson trained at the Art Students League with German expatriate artist George Gross, then worked as an assistant to Diego Rivera in the 1930s. Like other American artists of the post-war years, she was drawn to expressing in her own way the workings of the mind itself, with its compartmented memories and meanings. Her signature structures, like the Sky Cathedral series, are constructed out of found wooden scraps, scavenged fragments of planks, moldings, rails, and finials assembled into tidy boxes, each one unique, with dozens of boxes joined together to make up the wall-sized work. Her sculptures are sprayed flat black or sometimes white, submerging the former identities of the found fragments beneath an all-over compositional rhythm reminiscent of Pollock's similarly scaled works. Since Nevelson's sculptures are wall-like reliefs, the viewer always stands in front of them, as one would with a painting. Within the overall composition, each individual compartment maintains its own identity as a framed work of art, a stage upon which is played out a single moment of creation. Joseph Cornell also constructed a legacy of boxed memories, though in his case they were mostly memories of places he had never been and people he had never met. Pre-packaged commercial postcards for romantic holiday spots and Hollywood movies, along with early 20th century beach souvenirs and Victoriana, all of this he scavenged at local junk shops and kept as source material for his work. Cornell admired the surrealists Max Ernst and René Magritte for their use of prepackaged imagery in bizarre, discomforting juxtapositions. He took his remnants of faded glory and arranged them into assemblages within framed, glass-fronted boxes, each a psychological world within itself. Cornell's The Hotel Eden suggests tropical temptation, perhaps a white sand resort hotel now past its prime, run down and deserted, or existing only in memory. The temptation to read iconographic symbolism into Cornell's visual elements, together with the appreciation of his ingenuity and craftsmanship, give his boxes the appeal of a puzzle or a game, something that only fully reveals itself with the participation of the viewer. Though he never claimed the label for himself, many now consider Cornell to be America's greatest surrealist. America's artists adapted in the 1950s to their new role as the leaders of world art. The New York School's triumph represented a triumph as well for modernist aesthetics and its doctrines of artistic progress and purity. But the questions left unanswered about art and its changing identity were already providing the ammunition for modernism's ultimate overthrow in the 1960s and 70s. As we'll see next time, the American public, in a world now flooded with commercial imagery, turned for meaning instead to the homespun narratives of Andrew Wyeth and Norman Rockwell, and the growing tension between high art and media culture was reaching a breaking point as the first stirrings of pop art begin to be heard. Next time, Trouble in Paradise, as the 1950s and 60s arrive to rock America and its art. Until then, I'm Craig Griffith. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time on Art in America.